This is the CU Catecast, and we're talking today about St. Bruno and the Carthusians, continuing our series on the spiritualities of the church, the broad schools of spirituality that have become kind of universal within the church. So if you remember from last time, monasticism, the idea of monks and nuns, arose in general at the end of the age of the martyrs, when it was no longer possible, when Constantine brought an end to the Roman persecutions. Red martyrdom, bloody martyrdom, kind of came to an end, broadly speaking, at least certainly to a dramatically reduced degree. And so there arose the idea of white martyrdom or unbloody martyrdom. How do I give myself entirely to the Lord and seek the life of perfection? And we remember it all began with hermits, what we call Hermeticism or Hermeticism. And the idea was to isolate oneself from the drama of the world so that I could seek the life of perfection with this kind of me and Jesus intensity. Now, in the 500s, this is again from last week, Benedict established monasticism as a kind of group Hermeticism. We are leaving the world, but we are still we. We are still us. But it took about 2.5 weeks for Benedict to realize that leaving behind the drama of the world with other people just meant you have new drama, but now separate from the world, because this is what we do. And so Hermeticism remained a thing. There were people who looked and said, those monks seem to be doing okay, but I still want this kind of radical solitude with the Lord. And of course, social isolation is something that we have a special relationship with here in the last 5 or 6 years. After COVID, a lot of us found ourselves really reflecting on the time in which we were isolated from one another. We had phones and we had video chats, of course, but COVID was an isolating sort of thing. Most of us did not do well with that kind of intense social isolation, but some of us really did. I loved being isolated. I'm kind of naturally introverted anyway, and so my prayer life has never been so good as it was during those months or so where we really were kind of strongly isolated from one another. And it's not that I'm much busier now than I was. It's not that my schedule is dramatically different. It's just that the assurance of solitude, knowing no one is going to reach out, was for me a kind of especially beneficial sort of thing. Now, don't fret, I've prayed extensively and the Lord has not called me to the monastic life, so I'm not going anywhere. But some people really found that kind of solitude to be an incredible boon, a benefit for their spiritual life, and we aren't the first ones. That goes back, of course, all the way through human history. And unfortunately, for better or worse, the modern world is really not set up for that kind of solitude. This long gone are the days when we could just set up shop in a cave somewhere and caring people from the nearby village would come by and bring us food or bring us, whatever we needed to live. Those days are gone, but the idea of I want my vocation in life to be Hermeticism is something that really does continue through to this very day, and it's something that began, of course, right at the very beginning of Christianity. And that was certainly the case in the 1000s, or the 11th century, when Bruno of Cologne showed up on the scene. Cologne, of course, being in northern Germany. Bruno was from a wealthy family. He was very, very well educated. He, in fact, was chosen to be a bishop, but he refused that honor and instead decided that he really needed, if he wanted to continue growing in holiness, this radical solitude, the same sort of kind of thing that we're talking about. And so Bruno looked around and said, what can I do to achieve this kind of Hermeticism, this hermetical life in the 11th century in northern, what is now Germany. And so Bruno happened to call a friend of his who was loaded, a very, very wealthy friend who just happened to be the Duke of Calabria and Sicily. It's not a bad deal to be in line to be the king of Sicily in the 11th century. And so the Duke basically says, look, I'll give you a plot of land in some of the most beautiful part of the entire world, and it will be an austere plot of land, but you can live there and you can do what you need to do to be a hermit. And so Bruno moves from northern Germany, the cold bitterness of the sauerkraut, and sets up shop in the land of Roma tomatoes, and he finds this life very, very appealing. He builds a small chapel, he builds a little shack for himself near the chapel, and he settles in to become a saint. This is Bruno's big plan in life. But like Benedict, people keep knocking on his door. They keep looking for him and saying, hey, we'd like you to be a kind of spiritual teacher. But he says, no, that's not what I'm doing here. I'm not looking to set up a monastery. In fact, the Benedictines are just down the road. If you're looking for that, go look for them. And what was interesting is that the people knocking on his door said, we don't want to be Benedictines. We don't want to be monks. We don't even want to talk to you. What we want to do is live as hermits in this kind of shared experience, but still as hermits. Not just brothers, but hermits. And so he thought about this for a minute. And much like Benedict, he kind of thought, is there a way to arrange this where we can share this vocation but maintain this radical solitude that is so important to this particular kind of spiritual life? And so what that meant is that Bruno basically established a rule. He wrote a rule in which everybody there would be a hermit. They would have their own little shack. They would be self-sufficient. They would share the chapel, and they would share a handful of practical duties, but functionally, they would all be hermits, and they would be silent. They weren't going to talk to each other, or they would talk to each other as absolutely little as possible. And of course, the Carthusians are the origin of all the jokes about monks who never talk, or the monks who never say anything to each other. But they basically were looking for this idea of a radical solitude. But they wanted to have this radical solitude be in a relatively shared environment. And so practically, that means that as needed, the brothers would function as tailors or cooks or whatever, but as much as possible, they would be on their own. They would be setting their own spiritual program for holiness. But it also allowed for those brothers who were not priests, or for those brothers who were unable for whatever reason to function as priests, to have this vocation as well. Because what the daily structure looks like is that each priest brother, and Carthusians don't have to be priests, but each priest brother would say a private mass in the chapel at some time in the morning, and then at some time in the early midday, one of the priests would offer a conventual, the whole convent mass, that everybody would attend, and there would be a sermon, generally speaking. And then the rest of the time, the monks would get together 2 or 3 times to chant the office, to chant the breviary, the psalms, similar to the ones that was used by the Benedictines. But that was it. It wasn't all day in the church. It wasn't a highly structured or strict ritual of life. They would take their meals alone in their huts. They would live as self-sufficiently as possible, set their own spiritual program of prayer and penance and reading, which of course was dramatically different than the Benedictines, who had a very, very structured day-to-day life. And for Benedict, remember, the principle was all about stability. And so the strict structure of the day needed to be locked in. There's not a lot of room for brothers to be creative and figure it out for themselves. Whereas with the Carthusians, it really is you figure out how you want to grow in holiness. You talk to the Lord in your own way, and you kind of are experiencing this radical solitude in order to do that. And so while the details have changed a bit from the time of Bruno in the 11th century to modern Carthusians, which continue to exist, there are Carthusians in Vermont, here in the United States. There are Carthusians spread out around Northern Europe. They're usually in cold places. I don't know why that is. I've got no special understanding of why there are only Carthusians in cold places. But they are around the world today. And famously, if you happen to be a fan of chartreuse, the delicious delicious liqueur, which comes in the color of this chartreuse green or this slight yellow. The Carthusians do that. They invented chartreuse, and the color chartreuse is named after the liquor. It's worth your time if you're of age and you're an adult. But the Carthusians, the whole principle is radical solitude that is shared but not invasively. And that was the fundamental principle that kind of underlied their idea. And we have to say the Carthusians are the Navy SEALs of monks. They are absolutely intense in their spiritual lives, and these people are almost universally kind of, we look at them and go, that guy's going to be a saint one way or the other. It's just the nature of joining that order, because you can't join that order and be mediocre. It's an incredibly intense order. A priest friend of mine, in fact, just entered the order in Vermont. He basically had to say to his family, this is it. You know, he gets to write 1, maybe 2 letters a year. And that's it. There's no visits. There's no vacations. It's that this is now the entirety of his life. He will be speaking rarely. He'll be speaking when he says Mass. He'll be speaking when he goes to confession, when he hears the confession of brother monks, and that's about it. There will be very, very little else that his life will be other than prayer and penance and study of the Lord Jesus. And it can seem, and in fact, some priest friends have said there's no point in trying to talk about St. Bruno for the lay life because it doesn't really apply, but I disagree vigorously. For people who are established, that is, you have a financial establishment where you can live and you don't need to go out and do a lot of work. For people who are naturally introverted, who find a lot of their strength and encouragement in quiet. For people who are easily distracted or put off by modern society. And for people who have access to a well-functioning Catholic community where you can go to Mass on a regular basis and go to confession as you want. The fundamental principle of solitude really works. I mean, it really does. There's nothing that says, that if someone wanted to kind of embrace a general life of solitude, they could then establish an adjustable structure of prayer and penance and study that works for them. And in fact, even if we don't say that this is going to be a fundamental posture of life, you could also find this kind of thing to be seasonal. I could imagine, for example, that if there was a household of say one lady and a bunch of guys, as both of my sisters live in, if that were the case and all of the guys were gone for all of hunting season, for example, I could imagine that somebody who was a bit more introverted might say this Carthusian spirituality would make sense while all the loud boys are out of the house and I can kind of embrace the quiet. And you could see the same sort of thing where if it was an especially cold winter and you just weren't going to get out much, you say, well, this might be an ideal spirituality to think more about and pray with. The idea of solitude with the Lord is something that's good. It's not something that everybody can do. It does require a disposition. It requires a certain kind of personality, and it's not going to line up with somebody who has got to be out and out in the world all the time because they're dealing with family issues or work issues. But it can be an incredibly good spiritual technique if you are the kind of person who is established and who is a bit more introverted and for whom solitude, especially solitude with the Lord, makes a lot of sense. Now, obviously, I'm overlapping a little bit here between the Carthusian spirituality and Hermeticism in general. There are slight differences, but we're not trying to get into a doctoral thesis on St. Bruno here. And so that is the underlying principle. And so to review, when we talked about Benedict's principle was we want to seek the life of perfection away from the world by creating a stable platform upon which to do that. The principle of Bruno is solitude with the Lord. It looks like whatever it needs to look like, but the idea is simply that idea of radical, quiet solitude, at a distance from the world, and even at a distance from those people who are living here with me. Not for everybody, to be sure, but a remarkably important spiritual tradition, and one that we can tap into from time to time. Next time, we are going in the absolute opposite direction. We are going to the Franciscans. There could not be any further difference between two people than between St. Bruno and St. Francis. We will be looking at the general idea of mendicant spirituality, as well as St. Francis specifically, and we'll be talking a little bit about St. Dominic and things like that when the time comes. But that covers St. Bruno for us. I've been Father Ryan Humphries. This has been the CU Catecast, and I hope you'll join us again next time.